And number four, does he want us to transition to a communist society without private property in the means of production and a society where we will not anymore work to produce commodities? Again, the answer is obviously not.
To say that Harris is not a communist is not to say that her ideas are good. I think they're awful, what she's presenting. But what you would need to do is talk about the actual ideas that she's putting forth.
Is Kamala Harris a communist and a Marxist? Well, she is, according to Elon Musk, according to Donald Trump, and according to many culture warriors of the right. So today, in the podcast of the Ayn Rand Institute with Onkar Ghate, we will answer the question, who is a communist? And perhaps even more importantly, why does such a question matter? Why is it important that we name things properly? But also, we'll try to answer the question, why is it so important for many people on the right to find communists lurking under the bed? So, Onkar, before we define what a communist is, I think it's important to just say a few things about how do we answer such a question. So we have to find what is the fundamental in a movement, because people like Karl Marx or even like Ayn Rand, they said a lot of things, they had a lot of things that were related to their thought, but we need to figure out what are the fundamentals. For example, Karl Marx hated Russia, but this was not something which is at the core of Marxism. So how do we spot the fundamentals in an ideology?
I think that's the key, to say what we're dealing with here is an ideology. It's an ideological program. And that's what Marx is originating. And that's what then attracts so many followers. And I think what an ideology is doing is it's offering you a picture of where you are sort of in history and where you could go and why you should want to go in a certain direction. So I think of it like this. It's, how did we get here to our present circumstances, to the present day? An ideology is focused on that. Like, how did we get here? And then what's the cause or root of the problems we're facing today? And then where should we go? Like, how do we address these problems? How do we deal with these problems? Where do we go? And then how do we get there? And why is getting there a good thing? Like, why should you really devote so much energy in your life to getting there? Like, that's what an ideological program looks like, I think. And that's what Marx offered. And that's what when we're talking about communism as an ideology, that's the kind of thing that we're talking about. And you could talk a bit about like what the specifics of sort of Marx's answers to those questions, but you have to see an ideology as tackling those kinds of questions.
And that's a perfect gateway to the four fundamentals of Marxism, the four fundamentals of communism. And these fundamentals are based on our study of the topic. We just finished an 8-week course on Marx and communism. But perhaps most importantly, this is also what Marx himself and what Engels and what other scholars of Marxism consider the four fundamentals of Marxism. First fundamental, first key tenet in Marxism is a theory of how human history unfolds. As you described it, how we ended up where we are today. So Marx considers his theory of history one of his biggest intellectual achievements. And for Marx, the way we produce, the way we cooperate, the way we use tools, the way technology unfolds, the way the relationships among producers are developing, these are things that will influence, for others, they will determine how a society will look like. And they will also influence the transition from one society to another society. And now we see why this is a very important point, the theory of history that Marx has. Because according to this theory, we will move at some point from the current stage of history, which is capitalism, to a stage of history which for Marx will be superior, and that will be communism. So first key tenet of Marxism, a very specific theory of history. Second key tenet, second key characteristic, which will perhaps be more familiar to more people. It is Marx's unique critique of capitalism. So it is not a critique based on superficial things or what Marx considers superficial things in capitalism. For example, the fact that the rich don't pay enough taxes, which today, for example, is big on the left, or that there is income inequality. For Marx, this is not the key problem with capitalism. So the way he sees himself, Marx says, I managed to discover, to unveil, to make visible to everyone what lies at the core of the capitalist system. And in short, not to bore the audience with technical details, Marx says that at the core of capitalism is the labor theory of value and the fact that labor of the worker, of the proletarian, is actually the main source of profit. So the fact that the capitalist becomes rich, if we reverse engineer it, at some point at the root, we will see the exploitation of human labor. And here's a very important thing. For Marx, this is inherent in capitalism. So even if a worker is paid decently, even if we live in a welfare state or in a state where there's a lot of regulation protecting the worker, the reality still remains that under capitalism, the worker is exploited. Why? Because the worker produces something that Marx described as surplus value through his surplus labor, and this is the root of the capitalist becoming richer and getting his profit. So the second tenet, Marxist theory of exploitation based on labor theory of value. Third tenet is, of course, Marxist theory of revolution. Marx sees the working class as the subject of the revolution, as the class that will carry in its shoulders humanity, and it will bring it to a higher stage. This will be with the guidance of a vanguard, and this vanguard is the Communist Party. What type of society is it leading us towards? And here we go to the fourth tenet. It is a society where there will be no private property in the means of production, and critically, it will be a society where labor, human work, will be liberated. What does this mean? It means that we will not work anymore not to starve. We will work to express our creativity, to express who we are. So we will not produce what Marx called commodities. This means we will not produce stuff in order to sell them in the market. We will not produce for exchange. We will produce in order to satisfy human needs. So these are the four key elements in Marxism: theory of history, an analysis of capitalism based on the theory of exploitation, and a theory of revolution, and a society where human labor will be actually liberated. And before I get to your comment, Onkar, just one point to a possible objection. Someone would say, wait a minute, here you're using Marxism and communism interchangeably. Aren't there non-Marxist communists? What if maybe you will prove to us that Kamala Harris is not a Marxist, but what if aren't there other type of communists? And indeed, there are other types of communism historically, but they are, all of them, more, for a lack of a better word, radical or, quote, extreme than Marxism itself. For example, we have anarchist communism, or we have the Spanish anarchists of the 1930s, anarcho-syndicalists, who were even more vehemently against private property, sometimes not only in the means of production, but private property even in the stuff that you have in your house. So here we focus on the Marxist type of communism, but also let's acknowledge that this has been historically, at least in the 20th century, the key form of communism. So I think it's legitimate that we use these terms interchangeably. So based on these 4 points, is Kamala Harris a communist? Does she believe in historical materialism, in Marx's theory of history? Not that I know of. Does he have a critique of capitalism based on the theory of exploitation, based on surplus labor and surplus value? Obviously not. Does he want to organize the working class in a revolutionary party? Obviously not. I don't even believe we're having this discussion. And number 4, does he want us to transition to a communist society without private property in the means of production and a society where we will not anymore work to produce commodities? Again, the answer is obviously not. Therefore, simple as that, Kamala Harris, or for that effect, almost no one in the Democratic Party or almost anywhere in the United States is a communist. So, no, Kamala Harris is not a communist. Onkar.
Yeah, so on that reading of what the ideology is and what it stands for, to think of Harris as a communist it's a mistake, and it's in part a mistake because nobody today is ideological in the way that you can think 50, 60 years ago, that there were people who self-identified as communists and knew what that meant. It meant, yeah, I agree with the essence of this ideology, of this sort of viewpoint on the world, of where we are and where we need to go. And one of the central ideas, as you were saying, is that it was a crusade to abolish private property, to get beyond private property, to supposedly something superior. And the various attempts to do that in the 20th century were met with poverty, destruction, death on such a wide scale that it's understandable why many people have abandoned this ideology and will no longer will even think of themselves as communists, because in actual practice, what it showed itself to be is to be not a path to something good, but a path to enormous evils. And so to say people have abandoned this is not the same as saying they've actually rejected all the ideas that Marxism brought into sort of popularity or sort of into view, because there were many self-identified communists. So this was a widespread view. And to say they've abandoned is not to say they've abandoned every aspect and every idea of it, but the ideology is not there anymore.
And this sheds a light to why it's so important for the new right, or for the right in general, to portray its opponents as something as strong as a communist. And here's why. Both the right and the left suffer today from a lack of a distinct ideology. It's not clear what their principles are. And we see this, for example, that we see both the right and the left switching their position on some key topics in the last decades. See how the right deals with free trade, for example, or with the idea of American exceptionalism. Today, they're much different than what they were in the 80s or even the 90s or some years ago. So how do we understand left and right these days? We should understand them more as tribes rather than as ideologies. So they're not based on principles. Mostly they're based on a negative identification. A positive identification would say, we stand for these things. A negative identification says, we are not like these people over there. And this is the essence of tribalism. You have a group versus group. Not idea versus idea, but group versus group. So it's important for the right to make this negative identification vis-a-vis the left even stronger. And how do they do this? By portraying the left as communist. Because communist, as you said, has the strong connotation of the disastrous effects of actual communism in the 20th century, but also it has another identification. And I owe this idea to a discussion I had with you. A communist is someone we understand him as anti-American. So by saying the left are communists is another way of saying they're anti-American. Therefore, it follows, who is then the defender of America? Us. We, the culture warriors of the right, the MAGA group, the Trumpian right. And of course, this is very convenient because, as we've explained in other episodes, we see that the new right, the Trumpian right, moves further and further away from the principles of Americanism, from the principles of freedom from the principles of what of the Declaration of Independence and of the Founding Fathers, to put it simply. Therefore, to score an easy point, they can say, oh, but these people are communists, therefore, by default, we are better than them. So it looks like, Onkar, that there are political gains to be, there are points to be scored in the culture wars by calling the other side a communist.
Yes, I think that's definitely true. In as you were putting it, that it is they're anti-American, so we must be the pro-American side. And if you think of the slogan "Make America Great Again" of the MAGA crowd, that's how they want to portray themselves. That's what they want their self-image to be. That's how they want people to think about them. And instead of trying to defend, well, what are the American ideals? What was the American Revolution? What did it actually stand for? And are we living up to the principles in the Declaration, or are we not? Instead of dealing with all those positive and ideological things, matters of ideas, the way they try to present themselves as we're American is, well, we're not them and they're communists. So, and that it's so devoid of ideas. And I think there's another element in which they're sort of trying to pretend to themselves and pretend to other people that they're the pro-American side. And that's, they don't want to engage with ideas because what they would find is they share many of the ideas that is on the other side and that are in fact anti-American. So to say that Harris is not a communist is not to say that her ideas are good. I think they're awful, what she's presenting. But what you would need to do is talk about the actual ideas that she's putting forth, to the extent there's any ideas. And there's sort of slogans that she thinks resonates with progressives and people on the left. So she brings up often that she's not about equality, she's about equity. And equity is a modern term that comes out of egalitarianism, that's stressing what we should be trying to achieve, that if we're concerned with the good, what we should be trying to achieve is a complete equality of results, a equality of outcomes, regardless of causes. So we want the same results regardless of the causes. And that is an evil idea. It's true that there's an element of that in Marx, but there's an element in all kinds of doctrines that have come before, and that I think the American Revolution one has to think of as rebelling against. So Marx's slogan, from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs, was exactly to drive a wedge between outcomes and productive causes. Yeah, you might be a great producer, but that doesn't mean you get a lot. It means it's who has the biggest needs. That's how it goes. So it was a severing of cause and effect in the productive world. And it wasn't as though Marx came up with this slogan and everybody else objected and said, like, that's crazy. No, most people think of that, yeah, that's moral, because isn't that what religion and Christianity teach us? The meek shall inherit the earth. You should love your neighbor and even your enemy. And that's like, you're severing the causes, and it doesn't matter if they're good, if they have needs, they should be getting stuff. That is, and this was very much Ayn Rand's view, that egalitarianism is there from the start in these kinds of moralities, in the Christian morality and what Marx, it's his secularized version. They weren't so open in saying what we want is an equality of results regardless of the causes. But that's what they meant. And the egalitarians in the 20th century made that out in the open. And Harris is on the egalitarian side. And so there is a connection between some of what communists preached and the ideas she's picked up. But you'd have to argue that, and you'd have to argue the intellectual connections. And that's what they can't do and refuse to do, because they're tribal, as you were saying. They're unconcerned with ideas.
And also, unfortunately, egalitarianism is not something which is exclusive to Marxism. I mean, at the end of the day, what is progressive taxation if not some form of egalitarianism? You make more money, therefore you have to contribute more. Or think about Rawls. Rawls is the philosopher of, not of the Marxist, he's the philosopher of the centrist. I even know classical liberals who believe that Rawls is a great political philosopher. So are we ready then to say that parties of the right or of the center who support progressive taxation or who refer to Rawls, are they also communist? So communism and egalitarianism are not synonymous. There is overlap, but not every egalitarianism is a communist, and obviously not every bad ideology is communism. But now someone could ask, Onkar, why be so pedantic? Why do you care so much about definitions? Or they will say, okay, here are two professors who want to lecture people about what is a right definition, and only their definition is the proper one. But actually, it matters, and it matters a lot that we get our definitions right. There's this fake quote misattributed to Albert Camus, but it's a great quote. It goes something like, when we label things the wrong way, we add to the misery of the world. When we label things the wrong way, we add to the misery of this world. And that's important. Definitions matter. Definitions are not a pedantic issue because definitions help us to grasp reality. We can point to a thing and say, this is what it is. Words and concepts have a particular meaning. We cannot throw this out of the window. If we throw this out of the window, two very bad things will happen. First, we will not be able to communicate with other people. And the public sphere will become even more toxic. Think about how bad it was when the other side in the culture wars was making ridiculous claims such as free speech equals violence, or if you have any objection to the open immigration agenda, you're a fascist. Everyone on the right could recognize that these arguments, there was a serious problem there. Because if we stop speaking the same language, if we stop understanding concepts and words as meaning things, then we live in a Tower of Babel. Then, when reason goes out of the window, then the only language will be the language of violence. But I think there's something even worse there, an even bigger problem than the fact that we will live in a more toxic public sphere. And this is what a misidentification of concepts does to the mind of every single person. Because language and concepts are, I think, first and foremost, the way I understand it, a way for ourselves to navigate the world, a way for ourselves to make sense of what is happening out there. So if we espouse this complete stretching, not even stretching, this completely distraction of what words actually mean, we literally become less capable of dealing with this world. We literally become more stupid. So I think that at the end of the day, Onkar, concepts and definitions matter, and it's worth having this discussion.
Yes, they matter because they're your means of identifying what you're dealing with, what you're facing, what you're encountering in the world. And it's crucial to identify that, to understand what's happening, and to understand the causality of what is happening. And if you have misidentifications, you will misidentify and misunderstand, which means you won't understand the causality that's going on in the world. And take this issue of the egalitarianism and the communism. Yes, not every egalitarian is a communist, but every communist, when we mean that is what we were talking about before, that you're subscribing to this ideology, is subscribing to a certain form of egalitarianism. And when you're thinking of communism and you're looking at the history and seeing how destructive it was, that it led every nation that tried it into misery, destruction, and often wide scale. I mean, what wide scale here means in the millions of deaths. Is it, and one's thinking, like, why did that happen? what's the cause of that? If you think, oh, it's not egalitarianism, or it's only the communist form of egalitarianism that will produce this, then you think, oh, but we can try egalitarianism in other forms, and maybe that will work, and maybe that will produce something good. But if you see it as, no, the essence of why it led to destruction is this slogan, from each according to his ability to each according to his needs. And it doesn't matter exactly how that's put into practice. When people take that seriously and think they want to put it into practice in some form, it leads to destruction. Then we'll have a very different view of the causality going on. And here it's, I mean, I certainly think, and I think Ayn Rand thought, I mean, this is part of what she was arguing, of why she was so adamant an opponent against egalitarianism, is that in whatever form it's tried, including in Christianity, what it leads to is destruction and death. And so here, if you think that you're dealing, oh, there's people who want to oppose Harris, but if what they're saying, like, what we need to do is return to the Bible and return to Christianity, that's egalitarianism in a different form, and it's also going to lead to destruction. So you to be able to identify things properly and at getting to their essences is enormously important, and we use our concepts to be able to do that. So it has to be clear to you what, like, when you talk about a communist or egalitarianism, what is it? And then how should I evaluate? Like, what does it lead to in actual reality, the causal impact of this? And is that impact good or bad?
And one last point I want to make here. Another counter effect of misidentifying communism and saying Kamala Harris is a communist, it actually whitewashes and undermines the actual hell and the actual evil that communism was. Communism was the most destructive in terms of death toll, or among the most destructive ideologies in history. And when you say, oh, Kamala Harris is a communist, a young person who doesn't know much of history, they will see this and they will say, oh, okay, so then communism was progressive taxation, some affirmative action, and maybe some environmental regulations. Okay, it's not that bad. I mean, I don't see what the fuss is about. So again, it's an issue of it's a form of historical revisionism, and this is not what people want to do. But instead of actually attacking communism, they are making there could be the unintentional consequence of making communism sound more edgy and making it sound more innocent than it actually was. So for all these reasons, I think it's very important that we have this discussion. And again, it's not just an issue of pedantic definitions. Now, if our audience wants to dive a deep further on what is the left today, how it is different from the left in older times, we have a resource to suggest, which is an essay by Ayn Rand, The Left, Old and New, which is an essay from the book The Return of the Primitive, and also I think it's available online also as it's on our website. Also, last year I gave a talk in a conference, in our European conference, on what are some of the key characteristics of Marx and of Marxism that explain the success of that movement. So you can also have a look at that. And last but not least, as I said earlier, we've just finished an 8-week course with Onkar on Marx and communism. 4 weeks we discuss Marx himself and his ideas, and then 4 weeks we see how these ideas played out in reality. We talk about Soviet Union, Lenin, Stalin, the other communist countries, communist China, also Western Marxism. And this course will run again in a few months. So if you're interested, either as a student or as an auditor, you can check out in our website, in the website of the Ayn Rand University, and see when this course runs and how you can be part of it. Thank you very much for your time, for your support. Make sure that you are subscribed. We release a lot of videos these days, as you see, in many different topics. And if you have a disagreement, or if you have a comment, make sure you comment on the video. I try to read all the comments, reply to most of them. And if you want to see us cover a particular topic, you can drop us an email at newideal@aynrand.org. Many thanks to Onkar and many thanks to all of you for your time. See you soon.